kept the message short. 3 words. I'm on my way. My son had called me from the departure terminal at O'Hare. Not from the house. Not from the kitchen where I had stood with him 100 Sunday mornings, drinking coffee and watching the birds come to the feeder in the yard. From the airport. Gate B, he said. As if the specific gate mattered. As if I needed coordinates to understand that something had gone very wrong. His voice was flat in a way I hadn't heard since he was 19 and had to call me from a hospital waiting room to tell me his father's heart had given out. That particular flatness, the kind that comes when a person has already done the crying and is now operating on the other side of it. I didn't ask questions on the phone. I know my son. If I had asked questions, he would have started explaining, and explaining would have broken something open that he needed to keep sealed long enough to get through the next hour. So I said what I said, and I hung up, and I told my neighbor Ruth Ann, who was sitting at my kitchen table eating a piece of lemon cake, that I needed to take a rain check on the rest of the afternoon. She looked at my face and didn't ask anything either. That's why Ruth Ann and I have been friends for 31 years. I was 63 years old. I had driven that stretch of highway to O'Hare more times than I could count. I knew every construction bottleneck, every interchange that backed up on a Tuesday afternoon, every gas station where the bathroom was clean enough in an emergency. I drove it now without thinking, which was good, because my mind was somewhere else entirely. My son's name is Jonathan. He is 34 years old. He has his father's eyes and my stubbornness, which is saying something because I was not always known for flexibility. He had married Simone 6 years ago at a small ceremony in a garden outside Naperville, and I had worn a pale green dress and cried during the vows because I meant it, because I was genuinely happy for him, because Simone had seemed, at the time, like the kind of person who understood what mattered. Her mother's name was Renata. I want to be careful how I describe Renata because I have had 6 years to develop opinions about her, and not all of those opinions are charitable. And this is not a story about my opinions. This is a story about facts and what happened when facts finally had their say. Renata was a woman who had built her life around the management of appearances. She owned 3 things in Naperville: a catering company called Fontaine Events, a small banquet hall on Ogden Avenue called the Whitmore, and a sense of her own importance that required constant maintenance. She was not a cruel woman in the obvious way. She did not raise her voice. She did not make scenes. What she did, with great precision and over a long period of time, was arrange circumstances. She arranged them the way a person arranges furniture, slowly, deliberately, so that eventually you look up and realize you are sitting exactly where someone else decided you should sit, and you have no clear memory of moving. Jonathan had worked for Fontaine Events for 4 years. He had a degree in hospitality management and a genuine talent for logistics, and Renata had hired him 18 months after the wedding with the kind of generosity that comes wrapped so neatly it takes a while to see the strings. He was good at the job. He grew the corporate contract side of the business by 30% in 2 years. He brought in clients Renata hadn't been able to reach. He did this because he was capable, and also, I think, because he wanted to prove something to Simone, to Renata, to himself. That's what people do when they marry into a family that already has a scoreboard. I'm going to tell you what I found when I pulled up to the terminal. He was sitting on a bench outside the arrival's door with a single carry-on bag beside him. Not a suitcase, a carry-on, the kind you take for a 3-day work trip when you're planning to come back. He was wearing the charcoal jacket he'd had since graduate school, and he was looking at the ground, and he did not see me until I was 10 feet away. He looked up, and his face did something complicated that he immediately tried to put back in order, and I pretended I hadn't seen it, and I said, "Get in the car." He picked up the bag. He got in the car. I pulled away from the curb, and I didn't say anything for 4 full minutes while I navigated back to the highway. And then I said, "Tell me." He told me. What had happened was this. 3 weeks earlier, Renata had called a meeting with her accountant and her attorney and Jonathan and presented documentation, printed, organized in a binder with tabs, showing that over a period of 14 months, Jonathan had been systematically overbilling corporate clients and redirecting the difference into a personal account. The documentation included invoices, bank routing numbers, and what appeared to be email correspondence from Jonathan's work account authorizing the transfers. Jonathan had sat in that meeting and looked at the papers and said very quietly, "I didn't do this." Renata had said, equally quietly, "The records say otherwise." He had asked for time to review the documents. He had been given 48 hours. He had spent those 48 hours doing what any reasonable person would do, going through his own records, cross-referencing dates, trying to find the error, trying to find the explanation, trying to find the seam where reality and the documents diverged. He found inconsistencies almost immediately, dates that didn't match his calendar, an email sent from his account at 11:47 on a Tuesday night when he had been, verifiably, on a flight to Dallas. Numbers that rounded in ways that actual billing systems don't round. He had brought this to Renata in ways that actual billing systems don't round. He had brought this to Renata. She had looked at his counter evidence for approximately 90 seconds and said that she understood this was difficult, that she had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but that she had an obligation to protect the business, and that his employment was terminated effective immediately. She had also, in the same conversation, told him that given the circumstances, she thought it best if he and Simone had some space, and that she had already spoken to Simone. The last part is the part that mattered. By the time Jonathan got home that afternoon, Simone had packed a bag for him. She was standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed. Their son, my grandson, who is 4 years old and whose name is Miles, and who I will tell you about properly in a moment, was at Renata's house. Simone told Jonathan that she needed time to think, that she couldn't have him in the house while this was unresolved, and that her mother had advised her to protect herself legally until the situation was clarified. Her mother had advised her. Jonathan had asked to see Miles. Simone had said he could see Miles once they understood the full scope of what had happened. He had left. He had spent 3 weeks in an extended stay hotel off the interstate doing what I raised him to do, which was to keep his head and work the problem. And then something had shifted. I don't know exactly what. Maybe it was a particular morning. Maybe it was the particular quality of light in that hotel room. And he had packed the carry-on and called me from the airport, because airports are places where people go when they have run out of somewhere else to be. I listened to all of this without interrupting. I am not naturally a quiet person. Silence requires effort from me, especially when my children are hurting. But I have learned, over 6 decades of living, that the most important thing you can do when someone is handing you the whole weight of something is to take it without dropping any of it. So I held it all and I drove, and when he finished, I was quiet for another minute. Then I said, "How long has Renata owned the Whitmore?" He looked at me. "What? The banquet hall? How long has she owned it?" "I don't know. 12 years? Why?" "And the building itself? Does she own the building or does she lease?" He thought about it. "She leases. She's always complained about the landlord." "Why are you asking me this?" I said. "I'm just thinking." That was not entirely true. I want to go back for a moment because there's something you need to understand about me that is relevant to what happened next. I am a retired real estate attorney. I practiced for 28 years, the last 12 as a partner at a firm in the Loop, before I handed off my caseload and moved to a smaller life in a smaller house and started growing tomatoes with an embarrassing level of dedication. During those 28 years, I handled commercial property transactions, purchases, leases, restructurings, disputes. I handled them for individuals and for small businesses and for development companies. And over time, I had also, quietly, personally, made a number of investments in commercial property in the greater Chicago area. One of those investments was a mixed-use building on Ogden Avenue in Naperville. I had purchased it 11 years ago as part of a small portfolio acquisition. I had never had reason to look closely at the tenant roster after the initial paperwork. The management company handled the day-to-day, sent me quarterly reports, deposited the income. I reviewed the reports the way you review a utility bill. You check the total, you note that everything is in order, and you move on. The tenants were a dental practice, a dry cleaner, an insurance office, and a catering or event space, the details of which I had never particularly examined. I drove home. I made Jonathan a sandwich, which he ate sitting at my kitchen counter, looking like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to sit somewhere comfortable. I watched him eat. Miles' birthday was in 3 weeks. I thought about that. I thought about a 4-year-old boy who did not understand where his father had gone. I went to my office after Jonathan fell asleep on the couch. He was out within minutes, the way people sleep when they've been tensed against something for too long and suddenly aren't. And I opened my filing cabinet and I found the quarterly reports for the Ogden Avenue building. I looked at the tenant roster. The event space was listed as operating under the name The Whitmore, LLC. I sat with that for a moment. Then I called my property management company and I asked them to pull the current lease agreement for the Whitmore, LLC, and to email it to me that night if possible. The woman I spoke to, who had worked with me for 9 years, heard something in my voice and said she'd have it to me within the hour. It arrived in 40 minutes. I read it carefully. The lease had been signed 11 years ago, 1 year before Jonathan and Simone's wedding, so 5 years before Jonathan started working for Fontaine Events, and it had been renewed twice. The current term ran for another 8 months. The tenant was listed as The Whitmore, LLC. The guarantor on the lease was listed as Renata Fontaine, personally. I read the guarantor line 3 times. Then I read the default and termination clauses, which I had drafted myself in the original lease, because in those days I still drafted my own documents. I closed the folder. I went to the kitchen and I poured myself a small amount of bourbon, which I normally reserve for significant occasions. I sat at the table in the dark for a little while, not because I was upset, but because I was thinking carefully, and I think better in the dark and the quiet. Outside, the neighbor's motion light came on for some animal passing through the yard and then went off again. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that. Anger is a response for situations where you feel powerless, and I did not feel powerless. What I felt was something closer to clarity. The particular clarity that comes when a complicated problem reveals itself to be, at its core, a simple one. Renata had used documents to remove my son from his livelihood and his home. Documents. Renata understood documents as weapons. So did I. The difference between us was 28 years of practice. I did not want to destroy Renata. That's not who I am, and it's not who I raised my son to be. I did not want to punish her or humiliate her or take anything from her that she had legitimately earned. What I wanted was for my grandson to know his father, and for my son to be able to look at himself in the mirror, and for the truth to occupy the space the lies had been using. I started making calls the next morning. The first call was to a forensic accountant I had worked with for years, a woman named Dr. Patricia O.C., who taught at DePaul and consulted on commercial fraud cases. I described the situation without using names and asked her what she would need to establish whether a set of financial documents had been manufactured after the fact. She told me. I told her I'd have materials to her by end of week. The second call was to my former associate, now a partner at a firm in Schaumburg, who handled employment disputes. I asked about wrongful termination in the context of fabricated documentation. He said what I expected him to say. I took notes. The third call was to the management company. I asked them to prepare a formal notice of lease review, standard procedure, nothing unusual, citing the upcoming renewal decision. The kind of letter landlords send all the time, the kind that doesn't alarm anyone who has nothing to be alarmed about. Jonathan was in the kitchen when I finished. He had made coffee and was looking out the window at the yard in the particular unfocused way of someone who is not really seeing what's in front of them. I sat down across from him with my coffee and I said, "I need to tell you something." I told him about the building. I watched his face move through confusion and then something I can only describe as a recalibration, like a compass that has been reading wrong suddenly finding north. He said, "You own the building where the Whitmore is?" "Yes." "You've owned it for 11 years?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, did you know? Before all of this, I knew I owned a building on Ogden Avenue. I did not know the Whitmore was in it. The management company handles tenants. I don't review rosters the way I used to." I looked at him. "I want you to understand that this doesn't change what I'm going to do. I'm not going to use the lease as a weapon. That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" The point is that Renata constructed something false and used it to take something real from you. I want to deconstruct what she built. I want to do it properly, through the right channels, so that when it's done, there's no question and no ambiguity, and Miles grows up knowing his father was not a man who stole from his family. Jonathan put his coffee cup down. He didn't say anything. His father used to do the same thing, put things down when the emotion was more than he wanted to show. Dr. O.C. came back to me in 5 days. She had reviewed copies of the documentation Renata had presented, which Jonathan had kept, a decision I silently thanked him for, and she had found 3 categories of irregularity. The invoice formatting did not match the software version Fontaine Events had been using during the relevant period. The metadata on the email records showed creation dates that post-dated the send dates by 11 to 40 days, and the bank routing numbers referenced an account structure that had been discontinued by the institution in question 14 months before the earliest date on the documents. In plain language, the documents had been created recently and backdated, not carefully. Carefully enough to fool a person who wasn't looking closely, not carefully enough to fool someone who was. I did not go to Renata myself. I want to be honest about that decision. I considered it. There is a version of this story where I drive to the Whitmore on a Tuesday morning and walk through the front door and have a conversation that changes everything in one room in 1 hour. That version is satisfying in a particular way. I chose against it because I did not want satisfaction. I wanted resolution that would hold. My attorney sent a letter. Renata's attorney received it on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, I had a call from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, Renata's voice was on the other end. I heard her voice at holiday dinners and graduation parties and the occasional tense family gathering, and I recognized it immediately. She said, "I think we need to talk." I said, "I agree." She said she wasn't sure what I thought I knew, and I said that I wasn't dealing in what I thought. I was dealing in what Dr. O.C.'s report documented and what my attorney had summarized and what I was prepared to submit to the relevant parties if a conversation was more comfortable than a filing. I said this very calmly. I was sitting in my garden at the time because it was a pleasant morning and I saw no reason to be inside. There was a silence on the line. Then she said, "What do you want?" I told her. I wanted a written retraction of the accusations against Jonathan, delivered to every party who had received the original documentation. I wanted his employment record corrected. I wanted a written acknowledgement that the evidence against him had been fabricated, signed, witnessed, and notarized. And I wanted Simone to see all of it before the end of the following week, with no editorial from Renata about what it meant or how to interpret it. I did not ask for money. I did not ask for an apology. Apologies from people who are cornered are not the same as apologies from people who are sorry, and I did not have any interest in performance. Renata said she needed to speak with her attorney. I said that was perfectly reasonable and that I looked forward to hearing from them by Wednesday. I went back to my tomatoes. I will tell you about the Wednesday call only briefly because the details are not the important part. There was a negotiation of language, as there always is. There were 2 exchanges of revised documents. On the second Friday after my initial call, a notarized packet arrived at my attorney's office containing everything I had asked for. My attorney forwarded it to Jonathan. Jonathan forwarded the relevant portions to Simone. I don't know exactly what happened between them after that. It is their marriage and their life, and the interior of it does not belong to me, and I am old enough to know that even when you are entirely right about the facts, people's feelings about the facts are their own. What I know is that Jonathan called me on a Sunday evening, 11 days after the packet was delivered, and told me he had spent the afternoon at the park with Miles. He said Miles had asked him where he'd been. He said he'd told him he'd been on a long trip, but that he was back now. Miles had apparently accepted this and asked whether they could get ice cream. They got ice cream. Jonathan's voice on the phone that evening did not have the flatness I had heard at the airport. It had something else in it, not quite lightness, because things had happened that don't just dissolve, but something adjacent to lightness. The relief, maybe, of a man who has been carrying a false weight and has finally been allowed to set it down. I said, "Good." He said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner about the building?" I said, Because you needed to know I was coming to help you because you're my son, not because of what I happen to own." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a very lawyer answer." I said, "I was a very good lawyer." He laughed. It was a short laugh, the kind that surprises a person when it comes out, but it was real. I hung up and sat in my kitchen in the quiet. Outside the window, the yard was going blue with evening, the tomato plants dark shapes against the fence. I thought about Jonathan at 4 years old, the same age Miles is now, standing on a stool at this same counter eating cereal and telling me very seriously about a dream he'd had about a horse that could talk. I thought about how the years between then and now had passed in the particular way that years do, feeling slow inside them and sudden when you look back. I am 63 years old. I spent 28 years understanding that documents are not reality. They are representations of reality, and representations can be altered. I spent those same years understanding that the most powerful thing a person can do in a dispute is not raise their voice or move quickly or show their hand. The most powerful thing is to already know what you know and wait for the right moment to let it be known. Renata had walked into a situation she thought she controlled completely. She had the documents. She had the business. She had the daughter. She had built every wall in that room herself, and she believed she knew every exit. What she had not done, what in her certainty she had not thought to do, was look at who owned the floor she was standing on. That Sunday evening, I poured myself another small bourbon. I sat on the back step and listened to the neighborhood. A dog somewhere, someone's lawnmower making its last pass of the day, children's voices from the yard 2 houses down. Miles was at the park earlier with his father. In 3 weeks, he was going to be 5 years old, and I was already thinking about what to make him. Last year, I made a lemon cake because his mother had mentioned once that lemon was her favorite. But this year, I thought I would ask Miles himself what he wanted. He was old enough now to have opinions about cake. He was old enough now to have a lot of things. I finished my bourbon. I went inside. I washed the glass and set it to dry on the rack the way I has been doing since before my son was born, in a kitchen that has been mine for a long time, in a house that no one is going to take from me. I turned off the light. I've been thinking about what Renata actually believed the morning she put those documents in a binder and tabbed them. I think she believed that power was something you accumulated through what you owned and who owed you. I think she believed that a woman who grew tomatoes and had handed off her caseload and moved to a smaller house had moved to a smaller life. That's a reasonable assumption from the outside. It's also wrong. What I know after 63 years is that the things people do in secret always carry the logic of their character. Renata didn't fabricate those documents because she was reckless. She did it because she was careful. Careful enough to believe she had accounted for every variable. Careful enough to think that a retired woman with no obvious stake in the situation would not know what metadata was or how to read a routing number. She was precise in her cruelty, which means she was also precise in her blind spot. Jonathan did nothing wrong. I want to say that plainly because the story could make it seem like his salvation required my intervention, and that's not exactly true. He had already done the right things, kept the records, documented the inconsistencies, refused to sign anything, refused to disappear quietly. He had been carrying the correct answer for 3 weeks. What he didn't have was the leverage to make anyone listen to it. That's a different problem than being wrong. There is something important in that distinction. Doing the right thing and being heard doing the right thing are not the same, and pretending they are is how good people talk themselves into giving up. Jonathan didn't give up. He sat in that hotel room and worked the problem, and when he couldn't work it anymore, he called me. Not because he expected me to fix it, I think, but because some part of him knew that carrying something alone for too long was its own kind of damage. Asking for help when you have genuinely exhausted your own options is not weakness. I raised him to know the difference. I did not enjoy what happened to Renata. I want to be honest about that too. There was no satisfaction in it that I'm proud of. What there was, and I've sat with this long enough to be sure of it, was relief. The specific relief of watching a false thing stop taking up space in the world. Lies require maintenance. They require people to keep acting as though the lie is true, and that maintenance has a cost that gets distributed across everyone in the vicinity. When the documents were retracted, something shifted in the air around my son that I could feel even through the phone. That shift was not about winning. It was about the weight of the false thing being lifted. Miles is going to be 5 years old soon. He asked his father where he had been and accepted a long trip as a complete answer because 4-year-olds are practical about things they cannot change and are mostly interested in what comes next. What comes next for Miles is ice cream and a birthday and a father who shows up. The rest of it belongs to the adults who made the mess, and the adults have work to do. What I keep coming back to is this: the most durable thing a person can build is a record of behaving with integrity when it costs them something. Jonathan had that record. It was in his calendar, in his receipts, in the timestamps on his flights. The truth of who he was had been accumulating quietly, the way savings accumulate invisibly, steadily, without drama. And when the moment came that it needed to speak, it spoke clearly. Renata built something too. She built it out of control and fear and the particular arrogance of someone who has never been seriously challenged. What she built collapsed the moment someone looked at it directly. I turned the kitchen light off that night and went to bed in my own house and slept without difficulty. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing.